Okay, so performance assessments are any form of assessment in which the student constructs a response orally or in writing, and which the teacher judges in terms of that response. So you can elicit a student response either in a formal or an informal assessment context. The formal assessment context, what we mean by that is like the test, paper pencil type of scenario. Doesn't have to be standardized, right? We're not talking about standardized tests right now. We're talking about classroom sort of assessments. The informal would be something where you are walking around and observing, you are having the students do a project, you are finding different contexts and ways in which to assess the student, okay? And again, this can be observed during or outside of classroom instruction time. We also can use rubrics, for example, to make judgments. And we're going to talk more about rubrics in this week's session. But the criteria in the rubric has to be precisely defined and realistic, right? And it also should be shared with your students so that they understand what you're looking for. And here are some characteristics of student performance that should be considered in assessments. So in terms of the constructed response, that should be based on your students' experiences and their resources, right, that they come with. By constructed, what it means is that you should be taking into account your students' backgrounds, their knowledge base, their experiences to craft the assessment, right, so that the assessment is very much tied to them, very personalized. In terms of higher order thinking, here what you want to try and elicit in your test, in your informal assessment, is analysis, skills of synthesis, skills of evaluation. And in terms of authenticity, you want the assessment to reflect real-world concepts, but also to be meaningful and challenging and engaging to the students, right? Maybe the test can be on a topic that is interesting to the student, right? That relates to something that they may be looking on their iPhones for, or their phones, or the internet, or something that sort of connects with them on a personal level. Integrative, by integrative, what we mean is that it represents a combination of skills, right? It's not just one skill, but a combination. Also, that you want to try and have assessments that don't just focus on the end products, right? The finished products that would be turned in, but also try and capture the process, okay? So students may be not doing so well on the end products, but if you're able to assess the process and figure out the areas that need help in the process to get to that product, then you have a much more powerful assessment. And then, again, remember, these tests that you're giving are snapshots in time, so you want to vary these tests in terms of their depth versus their breadth, and make sure that each one is leading up to mastery, so that in that portfolio you have very, very clear evidence of this is where the student started in terms of knowledge, depth, and breadth, and here's how we progressed from that point on, and look what the student can do at the end. And those two, the beginning point and the end point, should be connected on a similar topic or a similar skill, right? It's something that should be comparable to give you that aha moment of, oh, look how much the student has progressed. Okay, and then student self and peer assessments, as I said before, very important. And it's important because when you have a peer or a student evaluate themselves or evaluate each other, what you're doing is you're giving the responsibility to them. You're really turning over that very powerful mode of grading someone or providing a score on someone or evaluating them on themselves. And this really helps the students internalize the high expectations that you are hoping that they take on for themselves. So here's some examples of a field trip report checklist. These types of assessments can be done either through checklists or rubrics. So in terms of the content, you can have the student, for example, highlight or tick which one they've done, right? My report has a title, tick. I wrote at least 3 paragraphs, check. My report tells where we went, check. And so this keeps the student accountable. It also helps them to internalize what should be part of a field trip report. for example. Okay, and then portfolio assessments, as I said, is the collection of student work throughout the year. And hopefully from that excerpt that I read to you before, it's one of the most effective ways to measure students' learning and growth. But it really is also based on how you put that work together, okay? I'd say half of the goal of a portfolio assessment is the way that you organize the information. And as you know, one very important skill for teachers is to be organized with their paperwork, and there's a lot of paperwork. So it should not just be a hodgepodge of work, right? You should be organizing the portfolio by content area, right? Math, writing, language arts, science, etc. Also, within those different content areas, you should organize the work by beginning, middle, and end of the year, right? Date everything, and keep a copy of everything in that portfolio. Hopefully you're going to have similar types of tests or informal assessments so that you can show, for example, an excerpt of writing from the beginning of the year versus the end of the year, right? So that there's something like a beginning and end that you can compare across time. This is what it should include. Samples of student work, also an indication of how students rate themselves or how they feel that they're doing in class. Completed rubrics from the teacher should be included there, and also evidence of how the sample is aligned with and meeting the grade level standards. And this can include work in progress. It also can include work that the student themselves has chosen to represent. But you should have at least 3 different samples across different contexts and genres. So what I mean by that is that if you look at your portfolio assessment, your portfolio for this one student, you're going to break it up by content area, right? So math, language arts, depending on what you teach. Or if you are in middle school and tend to teach more subjects, then, right, you would have all of those subjects represented. Within each, you would have a sample that was more formal, maybe like a paper-pencil test from the beginning, middle, end of the year. You would have a more informal assessment, such as an observation that you've done, beginning, middle, end of the year. And also, for example, a student self-assessment, beginning, middle, end of the year. Right? And you would have other assessments that you give throughout, but at least 3 samples across different contexts so that you can see, again, your snapshots are varied, right? You're getting a more sort of multiple perspectives of what the student can do in the different genres. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the different types of rubrics, because rubrics represent a really important component of alternative and authentic assessment for teachers. So a rubric can either be holistic or analytical, or a combination of the two. So a holistic rubric consists of a single scale where all the factors that are to be evaluated are identified together for each level of performance. Okay, so this might be like a checklist or a description of each attainable level of performance. Holistic rubrics are quicker to develop and learn. They're also quicker to score, and it's quicker to find agreement among various evaluators than it is with an analytical rubric. And also because in holistic rubrics they produce a single score, they're also the most effective when the elements being assessed are closely related. Okay. However, they do not give us as much feedback as would be as you would find in analytic rubrics, for example, to students, and so they're more difficult to use as a learning tool than we're going to see in analytical rubrics. And I'm going to give you an example of what holistic rubrics look like in a second. Okay, so this is different to analytical rubrics, which are excellent tools for teaching as well as for assessment. It consists of multiple separate scales and therefore provides a set of scores rather than just one score. Okay, and those multiple scales enable students to pinpoint their strengths and weaknesses in terms of what they can do, what they can't do, because it's broken up. The construct that's being assessed has been broken up into different skills, for example. So the analytical rubric provides feedback to students by letting them know exactly which elements of the skill were mastered and which needed more practice. Although it's an excellent tool, a teaching tool, the analytical rubric does take longer to come up with and also more time to score because it's a little bit more complex. You have to identify the different constructs in the particular skill. You also have to figure out how you want to score them, if you're going to have them weighted equally, etc. So it's also more difficult to get inter-rater reliability, where everyone who's using the rubric gets the same score, because there are different ways to score it and you have different levels than you would with the holistic rubrics. Okay, so here is an example of a rubric, right? And if you think about it, right, you can see that this rubric is probably about language proficiency. You can see speaking, fluency, structure, vocab, listening, and you get the rating 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, or up to 6. So here you can see that because this is broken up into different areas and each area gets its own score, this is an analytic rubric. Okay, let's look at this rubric, right? We can see that there's a rating, but if you read the description, it contains different elements that are put together, that are combined, right? So communicates competently in social and classroom settings, speaks fluently, masters a variety of grammatical structures, uses extensive vocab. So the fact that all of these things, right, and they're different things, talks about communication, fluency, grammar, etc., have been put together and you get one score, right? A student who gets this rubric back is going to get one score. This tells you that this is a holistic rubric. So, which rubric would this represent? Right? Take a second to look at it. Notice that it has different aspects of the writing proficiency described here, and that if you were going to tick one, that the student would only get one score, right? So this would be holistic. Here, it's talking about how well you can use English. This is actually an example of a self-assessment, but you can see that tasks have been broken up and that each task is rated in a different way, which tells you that it's analytic. This is also analytic. It's a little bit different because this would be informal, this would be formal, but it's broken up, right, in terms of what the student can do. And here's just a table of the different types of rubrics, the definitions, the components, when to use them, the advantages and disadvantages. So checklist, simple rating scales, holistic rating scale, and task specific. We also have a detailed rating scale, combination rubrics, and analytic rubrics. Okay. So the question is which scale to use, right? If as a teacher you're going to be creating rubrics, those are actually the best ways in which to assess your students in alternative, authentic ways. And there's several factors that you should consider, right, when choosing the type of rubric. So, for example, the first is the complexity of the skill. So, a complex skill requires complex scales for adequate evaluation. Simpler skills may require only a checklist. In addition, the degree of mastery expected with the skill should be contemplated. So consider the purpose of the assignment. Is the rubric being used to introduce a new skill or as a capstone to a unit of teaching? So those skills being introduced for the first time with no expectation of mastery may best be evaluated with a more simple rubric, which would be holistic, right? A holistic rubric would be more simple. If you want to try and assess a capstone to the unit, and you know that you can break down those skills into various levels, then, and also you actually want to pinpoint the weaknesses of students in that unit, then what you should be creating is an analytic rubric. You also should consider, for example, who has to use the rubric. So if you're expecting a number of teachers to be looking at the same rubric and your goal is to try and get equality across races, then you may want to consider a holistic rubric because there's a lot less chance of getting at different scores. Okay, so when constructing a rubric or a checklist, here are some questions for you to consider. What are your goals for instruction and learning outcomes? What are the specific skills you want students to develop in the assignment and which you are assessing? which structure of rubric fits best for the task, right? Thinking about what we talked about, simplicity versus complexity. Also, the levels of performance that you can expect. If you feel like there might be a lot of variation across your students, if you have English language learners that are at different proficiency levels, then you most likely want to go with analytic, because it gives you more flexibility in coming up with a profile of a student that is weaker or stronger in one area or another. What levels of performance can you expect? Are there levels of performance specific to each criteria? Here are some challenges to take note of. Okay, you don't want to use unclear language, because remember, this is a tool that is going to guide students in their work, right? And you should be sharing the rubric with the students beforehand, before they're doing the assignment. Ideally, that rubric should be guiding the students in understanding what is required in the assignment. And then, when you use it to evaluate your students, you're hoping that that rubric really captures the essence of how that student has done. Okay? So, unclear language such as creative is very subjective, right? What's creative to me might not be creative to you. But something that is more specific and more technical and more objective would be a clearer way to design the rubric. Be sure to actually list the ways in which students might meet the criterion. Don't use negative language, right? You don't want to say, if you have a scale that goes from 1 to 6, if 5, 6 being the highest, right? 5 should not be, did not do X, and that's the reason why they didn't get 6, right? 5 should actually describe all the things that they did right, but some of the ways in which they need to improve, perhaps. You also need to compare lower levels of quality to highest levels of quality so that students will understand what they need to do to improve. Another marker of a really great rubric is that students can get feedback of what they still need to do in the rubric itself, right? So it should list what students should be doing, and that can be a guide for them. And before you make the assignment, and when you are in the process of making the rubric, you should know your categories beforehand and have a clear idea of how many skills you're breaking it up into, what are the ratings, what are the scores, and what's the difference between. Okay, so in constructing a rubric or checklist, you're going to list the learning outcomes of the assignment and organize by importance, decide on which rubric or checklist is the most appropriate, and also decide on the point overall value. Because you've broken up your construct into different skills, you have to think about if some of those skills are more important than others, and then assign the weight value differentially based on what you think is more important. So what I'd like you to do is identify the appropriate rubrics. Okay, this is activity 1, which you can find in your unit where you're watching this video. So I'd like you to read the following student assignments for a class that includes ELL students. Okay, discuss, ideally with a partner, but hopefully you can do this on your own, which type of rubric is most appropriate and why, and be ready to justify your choices. Okay, so students must create and bake a pizza. Students must present a project on an important civil rights activist. Students must conduct an experiment to melt metal with magnets. Students must write a book review of a fiction book. And students must evaluate their own speaking ability. Okay, so take a second. You can also go back and look at the types of rubrics table and try and figure out which type of rubric you would use for each one of these.